Yeah, and there's research out there, like people say, oh, you're a flexible dieting guy. Kind of. Like I've become very centrist on a lot of stuff now. For some people, being too flexible is a very bad thing. Okay. I think structured flexibility is really good. I think having the option that if, hey, some event comes up and you'd like to go out to eat, understanding what's in food and having the ability to be flexible is good. But when do we all do best? We all do best when we're at home, training can be a focus, and we're kind of eating the same sorts of things every day. There's also a lot of data to indicate that if you eat the same thing every day, your hunger goes down because the more food variety you have, the more you tend to overeat. And there's a lot of data on that. So I think there is something to be said for limiting food choices in most cases.
Do you think some of that has to do with, things being like maybe hyper palatable? Like,
of
if you have
course.
too many flavors and too many different things?
Yeah, of course. It's we have an obesogenic environment. So, but what I don't like is people who take, stuff, say hyperpalatability, and they try to retroactively bring that back to sugar is causing obesity. You just can't say that based on the data. It's a lot of things are causing obesity because any one of these things by themselves, you can find things to counteract.
I guess we could say our phone is causing obesity.
Sure.
But it's just one small part of it.
So, and then as far as other people I know a lot of people who have kind of self-reported autoimmune issue improvements. That doesn't surprise me because a carnivore diet would essentially be an elimination diet. So you're basically taking out all FODMAPs, things that are fermentable by the gut, things that can cause a lot of GI distress or cause some people, we don't quite understand exactly how autoimmune stuff works. It's actually a really understudied field, and I'm by no means an expert at all. But, you have gaps or tight junctions in your intestinal tract. And it seems like certain foods can, for some people, start to widen those spaces. And when you don't have as tight a junction, inflammation can start. This seems to be a lot of what happens with like irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease. When you peel back to an elimination diet, a lot of those issues go away. But I think where I'll kind of digress and start to point out some of the stuff I don't agree with is you don't have to be on a carnivore diet to do that. You can still have some fruits, some vegetables. The point of elimination diet is to then add things back in. So the point of elimination diet is to take stuff out to the point where you're doing better, feeling better, then you add one food in. Go 2-3 days, see how you feel. Because if you have these issues, usually after a couple days, they start to surface, whether it's bloating, gas, just lethargy, whatever have you. And then you kind of can pick out, okay, well, that didn't do it, but that thing did. This didn't do it, but this thing did. And so I think one of the things, and I'll throw it back to Dr. Baker so he can give me some clarity on this, because I think it's important to have perspective, is I think you said that fiber, we don't need fiber.
Correct.
So how do you define need?
Well, if you want to say it's an essential nutrient, essential means you cannot live without it. And that's my definition of need. Now, is it potentially beneficial? I think relatively in certain cases it is, and then we can talk about that. But let me go back to some of the things Layne commented on. And I agree with, why do people have success on a carnivore diet? Obviously protein, having more protein. Most people are going from if you go on a carnivore diet, your protein's generally going to go up. And so a lot of people will find meat is very satiating. I know there are people that can overeat it. There are people that get fat on a carnivore diet, like any other diet if they eat too much. I mean, I'm not saying the calories don't count. Yeah. Obviously, there's some slop in that system. There, protein for one. Fiber is another thing. Those things, when you vary those things, there's going to be a difference. So a carnivore diet is very protein heavy for most people, unless you're eating, adding a bunch of fat.
So you would both agree that calories at least matter on some sort of
sure, yeah, I mean,
level.
absolutely.
All calories matter.
Well, I mean, they matter, but at the same point, you have to realize there are different effects of food. Now, we can go into, Ludwig's study. I know you criticized Ludwig's study. Mm-hmm. I saw your criticism, and I think that's fair, but I mean, we do know
not the study so much, just their change in the analysis of it.
They changed the randomization time where they went from pre weight loss to post weight loss. But at the same time, you point out that maybe for a maintenance phase, maybe that low carbohydrate may have an effect. And I don't know what those other 27 studies tested, if they tested maintenance or if it was just pure weight loss. And so,
well, it'd be interesting to see low carb overfeeding because we don't have a lot of data on that. There is some data in animals. The data in animal now, people say, well, it doesn't translate. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. There is data showing that even animals on like a 5% carbohydrate diet, rats, were able to get obese pretty quick on a high fat diet. Now, again, does it translate to humans? We don't know. There's not a lot of overfeeding studies.
I mean, I'd like to see, where there's protein overfeeding studies, which we know that, like Jose Antonio has done several, and that doesn't tend to show fat gain. I mean, they preserve only muscle mass, they don't gain any fat. So protein's almost a free macronutrient. I mean, not quite free, but you can overeat protein, but again, it's very satiating. I mean, I guess there's question if it's more satiating than other macronutrients. I think that's debatable right now.
I think protein and actually fiber have about the same thermic effect as well as satiation effect. The thing about protein and with those studies is that protein is a very so I wouldn't say it's a free nutrient. I would say you're probably not, if you like let's say you took a or labeled protein. So you took a stable isotope labeled protein and you look at, okay, do those carbons wind up in adipose tissue? Probably not many carbons from protein are going to wind up in adipose tissue, because the process to get from protein to fat, because fat's what's stored in adipose, not carbohydrate, small amounts. But the process to get from a protein to that is pretty long and arduous. One, you can either go, if you have a protein or if you have an amino acid that's ketogenic, you can take it to the ketogenic pathway and it can be converted to fat, maybe. If you have then it's even harder if you have a amino acid that's gluconeogenic, to take it to glucose and then to take it through to novel lipogenesis and to adipose tissue. So, that's really long. That's really a long route. But I think more of what would probably happen is that protein is going to be preferentially oxidized, because when you have high protein diet, you have high rate of protein oxidation. That means you're more likely to store the other nutrients that you're taking in. Now, I do think that you're probably going to have a lot more, and there's evidence of this in terms of uncoupling proteins, as well as rates of protein turnover, that it's energetically wasteful. And so, yeah, if you're on a higher protein diet, you're probably not going to store as much as the same amount of calories. We have a lot of studies to show that. In fact, my final take a shot PhD research study was looking at isocaloric diets with different, not even varying the total amount of protein, but just the quality of protein. And we saw differences in body fat and weight. So I'm totally on board with that. I'm going to bring it back around to fiber real quick, just because I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. So when we say an essential nutrient, I think it's still a little bit difficult, because if we look at fiber, if you talk about a fiber deficient diet, and actually I think a lot of the studies, because I've seen vegan criticisms of you and whatnot, and I piss off everybody. So I'm going to piss off the vegans now. I think a lot of the problems with when we look at epidemiological research of high protein, high meat diets is that they're typically low in fiber, actually. And a lot of the benefits of fiber can offset some of the problems with meat. Like you look at colorectal cancer, when you normalize for fiber, a lot of those associations with meat start to go away. So you look at fiber, like, do you need it as an essential nutrient? If you don't eat fiber, are you going to die tomorrow? No. Are you going to die this week? No. You can die this month? No. Are you going to die this year? Probably not. You can die this next 5 years? Probably not. But if you start to break it down and you look at the research on fiber, you get a 7% reduction for each 10 grams of fiber for breast cancer, 12% reduction for stroke for every 10 grams of fiber you go up. And there's a cap. It's not like you can go up forever. Too much fiber is a bad thing too, because then you start to get malabsorption of vitamins and minerals. You've also got like a 20% reduction in colorectal cancer or colon cancer for every 10 grams of fiber you go up. And then even with things like cruciferous vegetables, broccoli sprouts, lycopene, which is not produced in animals, you can't get that from animals, big differences in cancer. And so while maybe you're not going to die from meat, but you're not getting the protective effects of fiber. So we always have to think about are we wanting to, how much prevention do we want, right? So like all-cause mortality. And I think what we can say, I'm not one of these people saying saturated fat's going to kill you. But it's certainly not protective. Whereas if you look at like polyunsaturated fats, fiber, those are protective. So I have a hard time with saying I understand what you're saying in that you don't need fiber. in terms of you're not going to die today, you're not going to die tomorrow, you're not going to die this year. I think the problem becomes with how people out there receive that message. What we say as professionals is need, and what they may hear are two different things. So do you need it? No. Is it protective against a lot of diseases? I think the data is pretty conclusive that it is.
See, I don't agree with the data is conclusive. I think there's some epidemiologic study that show associations, and those associations aren't tremendous. You're talking, relative risk 1.2, 1.4, something like that. That's not tremendously strong. If we want to look at colorectal cancer, for example, and we look at all the factors that make you at risk for colon cancer, having a lot of visceral fat, being obese is going to be much more strongly associated with colon cancer than how much fiber you intake or how much meat you eat. We look at hyperinsulinemia, that's associated very strongly with colorectal cancer. If we look at irritable bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease, those things would be Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. If you have that, your odds of getting colorectal cancer go way, way up. And so, again, how much going on a carnivorous style diet impacts those things? If you get leaner, if you lose visceral body fat, if your insulin levels normalize, if your inflammatory markers go down, that's what I see. Again, anecdotally, lots of it's occurring. Your risk for cancer has gone down based on those metrics, and so you have to put the whole thing into the big picture. Now, bringing it back around to things like autoimmune diseases, and I think that we have or irritable bowel syndrome. 20% of the population is estimated to have irritable bowel syndrome, so it's not that prevalent. Autoimmune diseases continue to rise, and so my concern about diet is not so much how lean I get or body composition or even athletic performance. It's more from a health standpoint, and I see that people are, and to bring Layne's point, yeah, sure, it's an elimination diet, and I agree with that. And if again, if we step away from social media and sound bites and little tweets and snippets, if we listen to the overall picture, when I tell people, when they ask me about it, I say do the diet for several months, fix your problems, and then try to add stuff back in. I'm totally on board with that. I don't do it personally because I don't have a desire to do that. And the times I've done that, I haven't felt as good. And so, but I do think that if you can add back in, berries or avocados or, even rice or anything, I don't think carbohydrates are bad necessarily.
It sounds to me a lot of times what you're saying, Dr. Baker, is if your diet changes, then maybe a lot of the rules change. Maybe some of these studies, which are great to have, it's great to have all this information, but maybe those studies are done on just the general pop that maybe doesn't have the discipline to follow something like a carnivore diet. So if you're on a carnivore diet, potentially, maybe the quote-unquote need for fiber, maybe it's slightly changed.
Well, I think a lot of the, again, when we look at these associational studies, the thing I always say is, in what population and in what situations? Because we can say that people that have, an increased risk for this or that, generally what they're eating, most of the data we have goes on what most people eat, which is a, relatively carb predominant diet. And so I think most of our data comes from that. And so we don't have, good data on this cohort. If we look at, I just put up an Instagram post today on, First Nations people in regards to colorectal cancer. If you look at their numbers in the 1960s, they had extremely low levels of colon cancer. And this has been known in all these, northern populations that eat meat-heavy, very low fiber diets, that their colon cancer risks were very low historically. After about 1970, those rates started going up dramatically. They've gone up, in some cases, 1,000%. That is not because they stopped eating fiber or started eating more meat. Those things don't comport well. Again, if we look at, there's a 2018 paper study on colorectal cancer in Asia. They look at almost all the epidemiologic studies on Asians. And if we, how many people live in Asia? 4.5 billion people. Most of our planet lives in Asia. So if you look at all the data on Asians, there is no association with red processed meat, cooked meat, uncooked meat, and colorectal cancer. So if we want to ignore the vast majority of the world and say that red meat causes colon cancer, and I think there's some serious problems with that. I know the IRC came out with that statement in 2015. Professor David Clearfield was on that committee that recommended, and he was in the dissenting group, and he said basically they disregarded significant percentage of the data out there. They completely ignored studies. a third of the members of that voting panel were vegetarian, and they failed to disclose that. He felt people should disclose that. They said, we're not going to do that. And so I know we talk about bias in research. I know you pointed that the Nusi study that Ludwig does, and there is some bias there. And so if you've got a bunch of vegetarians whose lifelong ethical belief is I don't want to eat animals are on a panel, and we don't disclose that, I think there's some problems with that. And that, again, that IARC report has been widely criticized by many, many people. And so I think there's, like I said, if you're lean, if you're not inflamed, if you don't have, a lot of inflammation going on, then I think you got to look at that in the whole package. Now, fiber is beneficial. I would agree with Layne in many situations. If you're on a high carbohydrate, high glucose, high glycemic index diet, and you eat a lot of fiber, your glucose is not going to spike as much. We can argue whether that's important or not, but I think there's a lot of people that would say that it is.
Do we need fiber to poop?
No, you don't. I can produce it. I can put some posts on Instagram.
Produce some right now.
No, I mean, there's, Peary put out a study in 2012 looking at high fiber diets in diverticular disease. They had colonoscopies on 2,000 patients. The patients said, hey, the most fiber and the most frequent bowel movements had the highest rate of diverticulosis. And so that, again, that goes in contrast to what a lot of the epidemiology says.
Layne Norton, what you got?
Well, I think one, to keep in mind that if we start looking at highest quintiles of intake of anything, most things are on a bell curve. So it doesn't surprise me if we look at people who have very, very high fiber intake, if they start to have some GI problems, because that is correct. One problem I have, one thing I will agree with you on is that we have to look at our priorities in terms of health and people. So if let's say somebody's obese, and if getting on a carnivore diet for them, they say, you know what, I don't feel restricted on this. I can eat meat every day. I don't feel like the need to go off it. And it helps them lose weight. Whereas if for whatever reason they were on trying to eat fiber before, I can't think of a reason why, but if they were trying to eat fiber before and they just couldn't stick to it, or they found themselves overeating carbohydrate, then losing weight is going to be the single most important thing, and getting out of an obese state is going to be the single most important thing towards getting them healthy. Now, that said, my point is you can have all that and your cake too, cake being in this case fiber. You can have all that and then you get some extra protective benefits, because what we're talking about is, I'm not talking about dying early. I'm trying to look at longevity. So look at what's protective. So if we look at protective effects, it's very clear that fiber has protective effects, and not just in terms of, well, you guys kind of touched on it, but you add bulk to food. So if you have enough bulk, it helps move food through the digestive tract. And also the change in the gut microbiome. If you have enough fiber, it seems to create a microbiome environment where it's a little bit lower risk for colon cancer. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, and I'll throw this to Dr. Baker, I kind of perused your Instagram a little bit, and there's a lot of posts of meats cooked at very high temperature, so charred meats. Now, again, this is one of the confounding variables with meat and cancer. So I don't necessarily think that meat in and of itself is carcinogenic. But because if you look at unprocessed meat, it doesn't really have the same association with cancer that processed meats do. Seems something to do with the curing, the nitrates. It seems like there may be something there. We haven't quite worked out the details. Now, heme iron, there's some evidence that there may be some carcinogenic possibilities with heme iron, but then again, heme iron is also more easily absorbed and better to fight off anemia. So again, that's one of those give and take, right? But when you cook meat at high temperatures, particularly grilling or like sauteing in a pan, when the meat drips onto a grill or whatever you're cooking on and the smoke comes back up onto it, so anytime it's charred or cooked at high temperature, you get formation of what are called heterocyclic amines and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are both carcinogenic. Now, again, that may be one of the reasons that meat has an association with cancer, because if you look at things that are, there's some studies looking at like cooking method in terms of like boiling chicken and whatnot, there's not an association with cancer. So sorry, vegans, that isn't associated with cancer. And the hard part about a lot of this stuff is that we are looking at a lot of associations, but it's hard to do studies on this kind of stuff because, one, you're talking about different populations of people. Two, how long are you going to do the study for? And you've got to kind of do cohorts because you can't, people want to complain about how studies are done, but do you have $100 million to do a metabolic ward study that lasts 10 years? No, you don't. So we kind of got to take and extrapolate out. And I think this is where meta-analyses become very helpful because you're looking at studies of studies where they have strict inclusion criteria and they're controlling for different variables. So they're standardizing for different variables. And I love meat. I don't think people need to necessarily avoid meat. I think people need to be careful about how they cook it. Don't overcook it. If you do char it, cut off the charred portions. Boiling, baking seems to be better. Now, I own a grill. I still grill. But I do it kind of not daily.
Sous vide?
What's that?
What is sous vide? You ever done that before?
I don't even know what that is.
Oh yeah, it's like boiling it in a bag, basically. Those are legit.
And that's probably a fine way to cook it.
Yeah.
Again, it's not one of those things where, you eat a piece, people, the report that came out, like eggs are equating to cigarettes or,
Right.
cooking. That's just complete and utter garbage. I mean, that's what the hell style nonsense. That just it's simply not true. But if you look at the preventative effects, I mean, I've got a chart here.
Uh-oh, he's whipping out a chart.
No wipe off board, but so these are meta-analyses of all-cause mortality looking at trans fats, which is the worst. Saturated fat, not as bad as everybody thought it was. Saturated fat really got demonized back in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of that research from the beginning was very biased, and I've talked about that before. That doesn't mean that saturated fat is okay in unrestricted amounts, because at the minimum, it looks like there's some risk for it, and at maximum, there's some risk. And at minimum, it's not protective. Where if you look at things like monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, you're talking about dropping down 5, 10, 15% risk when you're replacing saturated fats with those. But do I agree that if a carnivore diet helps somebody get leaner and lose body fat, that's the most important thing? Absolutely. Absolutely. But again, it doesn't mean, so if we can do that, if somebody can have the discipline to stick to that, why not add in some fiber? Why not add in some other things that also have benefits?
How have bodybuilders used fiber? I'm not going to say that bodybuilding is the pinnacle of health by any means, but how have bodybuilders obtain these really, really lean physiques? You've gotten on stage yourself with a lot of success and have helped and coached people to a lot of success. How do the bodybuilding community, how do they use vegetables and fiber?
Well, first off, I would say the bodybuilding community is pretty stupid in terms of like they don't vary their vegetable intake enough. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has different benefits, and we just kind of stick with broccoli. For whatever reason, broccoli became which broccoli is great, by the way, because there's sulforaphanes in that are anti-carcinogenic, especially with regards to prostate cancer, bladder cancer, breast cancer. And actually, sulforaphanes now, there's some I'm looking into because my son is autistic. There was a study done where they showed really serious improvements in autistic markers with kids who did this stuff. Now, the problem is anybody who's been around autistic kids knows that you can't just get them to eat vegetables.
Yeah, they want to eat certain colors and textures. And
texture
things like that,
is, especially for my son, extremely important. He won't eat it if it's not crunchy. So trying to figure out how to get him to eat broccoli sprouts is going to be a challenge. So all that stuff, as far as bodybuilders go, I think they use it as one, it's just dogma, right? If you want to get lean, eat vegetables.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's dogma. But two, it's very filling. I mean, it's
Right.
hard to overeat on salad. You know what I mean? Now, I will tell you that I have had people decrease their fiber intake. I had one particular bodybuilder. His caloric intake was very high. So he was eating in excess of 5,000 calories a day in order to just like barely gain weight. Like he had a very fast metabolism. And he kept complaining about GI distress. He was always bloated. He always felt terrible. I said, well, what are you eating? He was eating 150 grams of fiber a day. He was eating probably 2 pounds of vegetables a day. And I said, dude, you got to cut that down. Like, that's too much. Like, I tell you what, cut it in half. Go down to 75 grams of fiber a day. eat some pizza, eat some like whatever, more calorically dense foods, and let me know how you feel in 3 days. And he's like, oh my God, I lost 2 pounds and I feel so much lighter. I feel better. I'm like, yeah, because you were literally like full of shit. Like you were backed up to here.
Yeah.
Like your shit was backed up to your esophagus, you know? So it again, too much of anything is typically a bad thing. And while I'm a meat guy, I eat meat probably, I would say probably at least 10 servings a week, you know, and probably at least 3 to 4 servings of red meat a week. I think saying that it's, I would be very cautious about like saying it has health benefits.
Right.
I think it is, I don't think it should be demonized the way it has been. Okay, let me go back. Health benefits it does have because, you know, again, anemic, protein, it's high protein containing. Animal protein is excellent source of protein because it's high in leucine. So there are some health benefits to it. So I should go back. Longevity benefits. Okay. But I also think that vegans take it too far too. So I'm much more of a centrist. Like I think if you're not consuming any animal products, you're missing out on a lot of benefits, especially when you look at something like dairy, which is associated with lower cancer rates. I've got it somewhere in here. Especially colon cancer. Calcium seems to, in and of itself, seems to have some beneficial functioning for colon cancer.
And your metabolism even, right?
Vitamin D, people who eat in the higher quintiles of dairy up to a certain point tend to be leaner, better bone mineral density, and lower body fat. In fact, for a while they were looking at calcium as a possible fat burner. It turns out it's not that. It's probably more to do with the fact that dairy is high in high quality protein. In fact, dairy protein is probably the best quality protein if you're talking about leucine content. So I think we can get a lot of these benefits of the carnivore diet that people are seeing without having to just eat meat.
Yeah, let me just piggyback on some of the stuff. So I know you talked about the highest quintile in the fiber study, but I mean that was shown, you know, throughout quintiles. The lower the fiber content went, the less the diverticulosis was, and so the folks that were eating the least had the least disease, and so it wasn't a sweet spot on the fiber for that particular study. Now, when you talk about meta-analysis of epidemiology, I mean, I think most of us recognize that epidemiology, regardless of the conclusions of them, they're not powerful enough on their own to make a cause for causation. You know, John Anitis, professor at Stanford, largely one of the most well thought of researchers, and most published guys around, has basically broadly said nutritional epidemiology is largely been worthless, and so any of the data we've gotten from that you really can't use, and so he's called.
I think that's a strong statement. I think it's.
Well,
I think it needs to be supported by mechanistic.
Well, that's his statement that the epidemiology. Now, I'd agree. You know, the gold standard we're going to agree is a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, which is hard to do. There is no diet that's ever been done that way. I mean, for a long period of time. I mean, and Layne's exactly right. You know, you're going to spend $100 million to lock, 50 people up in a metabolic ward for a couple of decades. It's never going to be done. So we don't have, when we're talking about longevity studies, if I were to tell you, we got a plane we're going to board, and one of the engines out, one of the wings is broken, and the landing gear doesn't work. And I said, well, that's all we got. So you got to do it. I'd say, no, that's not acceptable. And that's
Right.
That's what I see a lot of this nutritional data out there. It's just we're making the best guess on a system that's not particularly great. I mean, the problem with nutritional science in general is you can't kill all the people at the end of the study, cut them open and see what happens. And so it's not a pure science. And so it's a lot of guesswork and a lot of speculation. And so I think trying to make these proclamations about stuff, particularly when it comes from nutritional epidemiology, can be very misleading, because if you don't fit in that pattern and who they're studying, all three of us are very different people as far as the general population. I mean, we're all on the edges of performance, and we've all done stuff with our lives. It's just not the normal person. So I think you can't extrapolate that data to everybody. And so I think the most important test you can do is an N=1 on yourself, and I think you just have to try what works for you. And so with fiber, many people that put fiber back into their diet, it doesn't work very well for them, even small amounts. And again, I agree with Layne. There are potential benefits to fruits and vegetables. In fact, I think, if we go back from an evolutionary argument, we've been eating fruit longer, we've been eating meat probably. Meat came in about 3 million years ago. Fruit was arguably earlier. Vegetables, I would argue, probably came in much later. From a strictly standpoint, there's not many calories in vegetables, so it's not likely that early man was seeking out a bunch of vegetables to eat because it's not going to be very nutritious for him. And so that broccoli didn't reach the United States till the 1920s. Broccoli made it to England in the 1800s, cultivated around 2,000 years ago in Italy. So it's not like these things have been in the human diet for millions of years, a few thousand years at most. So to say they're somehow essential, I question that.
When's the last time you had a vegetable?
I had Brussels sprouts a little over 2 years ago. Maybe that's why, because I had Brussels sprouts.
I think it's kind of dangerous to try to infer what the intent of early man was when they lived to the ripe old age of 30.
Well, that's not necessarily true, Layne. I mean, there's if you look at the skeletal remains on these people, and if you look at how anthropologists date these skeletons, they will say that they'll look at a skeleton and they'll say this skeleton is at least 30 years old. I can tell you as an orthopedic surgeon, when you look at X-rays, when you look at kids, it's very easy to pick. I can look at an X-ray of a kid and say that kid's about 5 years old. And I'm always within a year. If you look at adults, and particularly with wear patterns, this is what they do to these skeletons. You see somebody with an arthritic knee. Matt Vincent put up his he put up his knee the other day. If I were to look at just his right knee, his knee could have been anywhere from 25 to 75. There's no way to tell. And the anthropologists that date these skeletons will say the same thing. In fact, they found skeletal remains of prehistoric man that was, they think, 60 years old, 70 years old, or older. And so much of these predictions on how old people lived was based on infant mortality rates. And it's not, if 50% of your kids die before they reach 1 year of age, your average population is cut in half. And so that's what these numbers are. So saying they only live to be 30 years is probably not accurate based on even what the folks that do anthropology will say.
Okay, but so I've got to call you on one thing. So your criticism of epidemiology is it's an inexact science, so we should disregard it. But then we're going to even more inexact science with anthropology and kind of estimating and, well, I can tell, and maybe we have no idea. And now, I'm not saying we should disregard anthropology. I think we just need to understand where it fits on our continuum of evidence. I think it's, first off, even if we discovered Paleolithic man ate a certain way, and we were very certain of it, which we're not, I don't really care. I care about what do we have data-wise now that indicates prevention and whatnot. And I agree with you. I think epidemiology is, I cannot stand it when I wake up, open the paper, well, 20 years ago when you open the paper, dating myself, when you go to Yahoo or Google or whatever, and there's a new article that says, this causes this increase in, no, that's not how it works. You're talking about risk, okay? And there's a lot of inexact science with epidemiology, and I'll give you an example, because I can admit when this stuff is not exact science, because I've criticized epidemiology before. In the summer months, ice cream sales go up. Murder also increases. Do we think ice cream causes murder? Probably not. Because why does murder go up? Well, there's a lot of confounding variables. There's more people outside. It's hotter. People around each other, probably more irritable. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this. So it's very dangerous to make associations, but that's why anthropology, epidemiology, cohorts, meta-analyses are kind of our gold standard, because now you're not just looking at a few thousand data points. You're looking at some of these meta-analyses are hundreds of thousands of data points. So I think just because it's kind of like the people that make the argument that, well, we're not bomb calorimeters, so you can't really know exactly how many calories you're getting out of food, so calories are stupid. No, calories aren't stupid. Just because we can't measure it exactly doesn't mean we should just disregard it. We just acknowledge that we can't measure it exactly. And when we talk about science, all science is inexact science. I mean, we're always learning new things. We're understanding data more and more. So like 40 years ago, saturated fat was going to kill you. And now we know it's probably not as bad as we thought it was. But there's still, I mean, even like, I think the important thing is when you find an epidemiological association, then start looking for mechanisms. Is there an underlying mechanism there? So we know that there are some underlying mechanisms with certain fibers, that there's antioxidant benefits, that there's benefits on the tight junction. Also, inflammation, those sorts of things. Now, for some people, for some individuals, they can get aggravated because of bowel issues, but that doesn't mean that everybody should not be eating fiber, right? And I think we got to be really careful when we point out anecdote. So everybody, drinking game, take a shot whenever I say PhD, and take a shot whenever Shawn talks about anecdotes. So
people are going to be hammered.
People are going to be hammered
that's
by
the
the end
best
of this.
podcast I ever heard.
But, because everybody knows somebody who ate fast food every day and smoked and lived to be 95. We've all, that doesn't mean everybody should smoke. So we got to be really careful about this stuff. So when I talk about this, I'm not saying if you as an individual don't eat fiber that you're going to die of colon cancer. I can't say that because I don't know that. What I can say is that you're probably increasing your risk, but you may never get it because maybe there's certain genetic underlying factors that make you more protective.
Are there any laws in nutrition? Like, I know if I drop this pen, it's going to fall because of something called gravity.
We're fairly certain it's going to fall.
Yeah, that's true.
Pretty high.
Yeah,
level
who knows? We're spinning and
I start my talks out like that. Have you ever seen my talk? I take a pin. I always have a pin as a prop, and I say, you can never prove anything in science. There's just certain things that we have a high degree of certainty about.
Right.
And then I drop the pin, and I'm like, oh, look, it worked again. Right. So, but nutrition is pretty, like my friend Jeremy Lineker always says, there's data I'd be willing to bet my toe on, my leg on, or my toe on, my foot on, my leg on, and my life on. So you bet your life on gravity that we probably got that one right. But, some of this nutrition stuff, it's tough to work out, but that's why we talk about it in terms of risk. And we talk about it in terms of, that's why I'm trying not to make absolute statements here.